So today, what we're going to be taking a look at is we're going to be taking a look at the frameworks. And basically, we'll be looking at teaching and learning through the framework for information literacy. But both of the frameworks, at least in my case, help me plan, and they help me plan for what students aren't getting. They help me recognize what students aren't getting, and they help me recognize my own expertise blindness. Even in the conversation that we had last week, or a couple weeks ago, Harry and Dustin were asking some questions, and I don't know about them, but I was like, oh, here's another little bit of expertise blindness that I'm not recognizing in my students. So that was very helpful. The other thing that the frameworks do is they help to, by virtue of how we're approaching them, they help avoid students doing this mimicry thing where they just want to give you the right answer. They can mimic what you want to hear maybe, but we're looking at seeing how they're thinking and where their misconception lies and if they're retaining them even after we teach. So that's what I see the benefits to this being. So you should remember that Jesse talked to us about the threshold concepts. So the framework for information literacy is all about threshold concepts. The frames are the threshold concepts as laid out by the ACRL. And so just a brief refresher, I think it's been a couple months since we looked at them, but the threshold concepts are transformative. So this is where people start to think like and you can fill in the blank, think like an educator, think like a mathematician, think like a biologist, etc. They're irreversible, so once students and faculty cross the threshold, they can't be unlearned. They generally aren't transferable to other systems, so if you are an expert in one system, that doesn't mean that you're not necessarily an expert in another system. You have, they're integrative, so they will change over time, and that's an important concept as we think about teaching these literacies, because students will get them and then they'll back away from the threshold. They'll almost get there, they'll back away, and then you can see the lights go on when they finally cross, but it may take a number of iterations to get them there. And they're difficult to grasp, and they are not always measurable. So that's just a quick review of what Jesse talked to us about in terms of threshold concepts. She also gave us this diagram talking about the threshold crossing, and we're going to be referring back to parts of this diagram throughout the rest of the presentation. So we talk about these students being on a journey through this developmental stages, which is preliminal, and that's where all of us come in as instructors. Is the strategy here is to disrupt their thinking, to give them scenarios, to give them assignments, to give them lessons that make them wonder or want to know more. So that's where we talk about they have this encounter with some troublesome knowledge that they need to wrestle with. And then moving forward in this liminal stage where they're moving between the threshold, they're starting to cross the threshold, they're not quite there yet. They're looking at really trying to get rid of what they've known and what their conceived notions are. And they're going to hopefully either integrate new information or discard old ideas they have for new ones. And this is the part where, as instructors, we need to come up with tools that will help them cross the threshold. We need to give them a lot of feedback, and we need to have some formative assessment going on so we know where they are. And then after they cross the threshold, that's what we want. That's what we want to have happen, is we want them to cross that threshold. And we're going to do that by structuring our lessons and activities to get them to do that. And then we need to think about how we're going to measure that. And that tends to be summative assessments, either chapter or unit exams, as well as end of course exams, those kinds of things. So this is just an overview of those different stages. So preliminal stage is where the learners are influenced by both their motivation to learn, what they already know, and how strong that internalized knowledge and those preconceived ideas are. So it's our job as instructors to try to encourage them, motivate them to want to move on. Liminal stages are, you can see, it's where the transition happens, where they cross the threshold, but you might not always see it. You might need to poke at the students a bit multiple times to get them to understand, to practice, and to get them to go toward the threshold and then actually cross over. Like, did they get it? Did they get it? No, not yet. So that's kind of the indication of the liminal phase. And then the post-liminal phase is, where they've crossed the threshold and they then can no longer go back to their old ways of thinking. So that's a brief overview of what we've been talking about for a couple of months. And there's a process that we can use to do this, and there's a process that you folks have been engaged in, and you've done it in part. And that is to identify what it is you want the students to be able to know and do. So at the end of this lesson, at the end of the class, at the end of the unit, what will learners be able to do? And for educators, that's what learning is all about, is trying to figure out what to teach, how to teach, and then measure it at the end. So educators will always start out with, at the end of this unit, learners will be able to, and you'll either have a change in what they know, what they can do, or how they think or feel about something. So the next step in that is to jump right to the end. So how do you measure that? And Jesse and I have been asking you folks to follow this pattern. So how do you know when students get to that goal? How do you know if they get it? And this is where we talked a little bit about making sure your assessment matched the learning outcomes, and that became apparent to us when we looked at the research skill development framework. But it's also true when you take a look at the framework for information literacy. So again, last week when I was talking with Harry and Dustin, there was a place that I recognized that I was having students make too many unscaffolded leaps, and I was making some assumptions, and I'm not sure that my assessments are matching what I want them to do. So I'm going to need to revisit that. And during this time, then there's two different kinds of assessment that we're going to use. We're going to use formative assessments, where we get teacher and student feedback as they're learning. And then at the end, we're going to have the summative assessments. So we take a look at the outcomes, how are we going to measure it, and then we start to plan the learning activities to get from point A to point B. So that's the strategies we are using. Do either of you have questions or comments at this point in time?
No, I'm good.
All right. So we're going to start the journey. And if we take a look at starting the journey with the framework for information literacy, the first step is to purposely create some sort of crisis, and I use the crisis in quotation marks, some sort of way to create a disconnect between what they already know and what they need to know. So we're going to challenge the students thinking about what they know, look at what they don't know, or have them look at recognizing what they don't know, and also challenging what they think they know. And I tried to pull up a couple of examples that I might use for today's introduction to this, or for today's presentation. And I was looking at Haiti. It was mentioned in the news a couple of days ago. And so I went out and found a little bit about Haiti, and I was wondering how they were recovering from the last hurricane. And during the process, I found out more information about Haiti and the natural disasters they faced. And it's more than just one hurricane a year or so ago. It's more than that. So there's some things I don't know about Haiti, and I was trying to pick a neutral topic. So Haiti, and I just have this image, and that's for right now where I want to go with it. But the other one came from my class. It actually came from my mother-in-law. We were talking this past Christmas about Northern Lights, and I asked her where Northern Lights came from, and she said, oh, it's the reflection of light off the glaciers. And I was stunned by her thinking that that was the case. And when I came back to class, I was talking to my class about this particular response I got from her. And so I asked my students, I said, where did the Northern Lights come from? And one of my students said it comes from light bouncing off of the glaciers at the North Pole. So this is a science misconception. Dustin, do you have some familiarity with this, or do you know where people are getting this idea from?
I mean, I haven't heard that one in particular, but it's, yeah.
So,
there are a lot of really fun misconceptions you run into.
So I was on the verge of saying, how many people really think that? And kind of making fun of my mother-in-law, and I thought, yeah, I maybe should not do that. So one of the challenges is to bring up misconceptions without having people feel ridiculed.
Yeah.
So for me, that was an eye-opener, and I'm going to use those for examples for today and talking about today. So as we take a look at moving forward, there are some underpinnings to the method that we should talk about. And I don't know if you folks are familiar with these theories, but there's a number of them out there. But constructivism is this idea where people construct their own knowledge, and teachers become facilitators and start to relinquish control of their classroom. There generally are no lectures, but demonstrations There generally aren't any lectures, demonstrations, presentations, but the teachers need to really scaffold instruction to guide students, to provide activities, to ask questions, to direct them to knowledge that they need to know. So that's one idea, the constructivist idea. There's also, have any of you heard of Paulo Freire and his dialogue ideas, theories? Dustin, did you get exposed to those in your time as a...
I'm really familiar with constructivism. I use that a lot in my classes, but I don't know Paulo Freire.
So he actually has a number of ideas, but one of them that pertains to us in particular is the idea that you learn through discussion. So you question what you know, and then by having discussions with each other, you come to change the way you think and know. So those are there's a number of theories that underpin what all of us are doing and trying to do, but those are two that I want to just bring to our attention for today. And as we start to move forward, we know what we want to do. We know that we want students to be engaged. We know that we want students to think critically. We know that we want them to be problem solvers. The question then is, how do we do this, and how do we measure it when we're doing it? So that's what the rest of today is going to be about. So as I take a look at this, I presented to you at the start of the presentation this idea about Haiti and its natural disasters and the Northern Lights issue. So how would you folks start that inquiry? What would you do?
I like to generate, why would you pick this as a topic? Does it align with your personal interest or your major? Because, yeah, it's so broad, right, that you need to quickly scope it down.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the tricky thing with the Northern Lights is if you already have an answer, even if it's a wrong answer, then it's not really a question anymore.
Right.
And so you have to present them with some sort of evidence that disproves their answer.
Right, right. And things that they already have an answer to are very hard to revise or get rid of and replace. So that can be difficult too. So one of the things, one of the starting places that we can use is to think about creating an assignment and then figure out a way to introduce the framework for information literacy so that you can mesh the two of them together into sort of this one seamless assignment. So one of the things that I found, we'll talk about it a little more, but there's this book. And the title of it is Make Just One Change. And they talk about creating questioning techniques, but you give up the question. So what you do is you start with an idea, a proposal, a sentence, a thing to be investigated. And they talk about the right question strategy. So in this particular case, for an example, what I would do is create a prompt for students to generate their own questions. So the idea behind the Make Just One Change and the right question strategy is to not give students the questions or the answers, but to come up with this theme, and then the students generate what questions they have about whatever it is you're posting. So in this case, I would post a starter that just said Northern Lights, or if I was looking at Haiti, I would do Haiti's natural disasters. And now the idea is that students need to generate their own questions about those topics, and then as an instructor, you circle back and you start to then ask them questions, give them places to go look, talk about research strategies they might use to answer their own questions. But the other thing it does is, as I created this example, I have the topic, I have the assignment, but what I'm doing is I'm starting to also look at and embed the framework for information literacy. So in this particular case, if I went back and took a look at the frames, I'm looking at the research as inquiry, and I'm starting to have students generate their own questions. So I'm being intentional about the strategy I use and how I integrate the framework for information literacy into my teaching. So that's a strategy to consider as we move forward. Not necessarily this particular strategy, but as you start taking a look at strategies that you can use for your own classroom and for your own lessons, we start taking a look at how to get students to be active learners or active participants. And we start to relinquish control of our classroom. And for me, this was a bit hard to do. I think it was easier for me than some of my colleagues. But there are still times when I find myself wanting control. There's also some times where I purposely don't relinquish control, and safety, doing things with safety is not something where I want students to be doing discovery learning. 10 fingers coming in and 10 fingers going out of the door is definitely a good idea, and that's so things that revolve around safety or things that are facts that I can disseminate quickly are not something that I necessarily need for students to discover. So I want to make that clarification. But when I'm trying to get my students to think deeply, then I start taking a look at active learning principles. And those are things like, how do I get students physically manipulating or interacting with the information that I want them to wrestle with? I might have them process information, so elaborate or explain some material, asking questions, and that's where that book that I just showed you came into play. Talking about metacognitive monitoring. What did you learn? How can you demonstrate that? And then some social collaboration. So those are active learning strategies that help teachers relinquish control and get students to actually process information and think about it at a deeper level. So if we structure things correctly, we get students to have this crisis, this, okay, I don't know everything I need to know. And now we're into going through their learning activities. And at this stage, we're in the liminal stage of the frameworks, where they're starting to discard information that they thought they knew. They're starting to integrate new information. And this is the point at where formative assessments come back or come into play. So it's where you provide ongoing feedback for your students. How are they doing? Do they need to revise something? Students are able to look at how they can improve their learning. And also teachers get to look at how they can improve instruction. What are students getting? What are they not getting? And a lot of times you will have low stakes or non-graded assignments. So it's a cycle, and it should be pretty iterative, and it should be pretty quick. And it could be as simple as going around and asking students what they think about a certain topic or things like that. Questions or comments up to this point? All right, hearing none, I will continue to move forward. So then, as we continue moving forward, and we finish off the lesson, the real question then becomes at the end, did they get it? Did they cross the threshold? Did they move from taking a look at being a novice at a particular idea or particular information literacy skill, or did they make it? So this is where we have the summative assessments. And this then is where we start taking a look at more formalized assessments. So these are where you should have authentic assessments. They should They should look like what you're really wanting students to do in real life. So if you want them to integrate literature or do a literature search, can they do that? Can they do it on their own? Can they do it without scaffolding? Can they do all the subcomponents to it? Can you have an assignment where they have to go do a search for something that really applies to something they might do in real life when they go out into the world of work or when they go out into the field, but something that's very real and what they're going to need to do. It also needs to provide useful feedback to students and the assessments, and after they've crossed the threshold, it should help them redefine how they see themselves. So they don't see themselves as a novice anymore, but they start to see themselves as an expert. They can think about what they learned, so whatever the assessment is, it helps them think metacognitively. They can link their learning to the grading. And probably the biggest thing is to allow for individual variance. So as you're thinking about how you're going to do your summative assessments, keep in mind that different individuals have different starting points and may have different ending points. They may not have crossed the threshold. They may still be in the liminal stage. But how can you measure where they are, allow for individuals' unique gifts and where they're starting and ending and how much progress they made? And so that's kind of the question is, we all have expertise in designing content for our areas, but then how do we assess it effectively, both formatively and summatively, particularly summatively? So with that, your assignment for this upcoming week or upcoming module is to identify a threshold concept that's getting in the way of your students' performance, and then plan a learning activity that introduces your students to the threshold that you choose. Describe how you're going to integrate this into your overall class, and then think about how you're going to assess it. And we have a number of resources posted for you, so you can adapt some posted examples, and then we're going to have you, after you've gotten this all figured out and the answers down pat, we're going to have you go to Flipgrid and describe your learning activity and possible assessments. So that is going to be your assignment. Hang on and we'll take a look at some resources here. So in the module, Jessie has posted different examples for you, and they will look something like this. They'll look like Teaching Authority 1, Teaching Authority 2, and there's an example of how these connect to the different frames in the framework for information literacy. So the things that she's posted for you is some cover material which talks about what the framework is. It talks about what the underpinning theory is. Then it tells you how you need to structure it, and it provides you with a lesson about instruction and then how you might assess it. And they're actually very good examples. So she's posted an example from each of the frames, and they come from the books that are up here. Oberlies and Mattson have taken a look and collected examples for all the different frameworks, and we just got this series last fall and we are starting to look at it. So it's a really interesting set of books that gives you examples of how you might teach and what sort of activities you have. Then in addition to that, she has posted an article a roadmap for assessing student learning by Oakleaf, which really talks about framing how you're going to take a look at the information literacy within the context of your own personal experience. And it talks about the frames a little bit and the development of those. And then it talks about taking a look, the other one, the Guide to Information Literacy Assessment, and the ACRL framework rubrics and assessment materials. There's all sorts of assessment materials there for you to look at. There's a lot of examples for you to go look at. Dustin, I think there's a biology one that she's posted in a couple of examples that you might find interesting.
Okay.
So I think she tried to post something for everybody there. And then we're actually starting to wind down our community of practice. So this current module should be up and running. It should have been up and running last Thursday, so hopefully you can access it. The next module is going to start on 4/19, where we're going to come back and share and talk about our experiences relative to how well we accomplished this or what the stumbling blocks were. And then we'll meet again face-to-face on the 23rd. I believe we have this meeting. I believe we have that meeting and one more meeting. So in our final meeting, we're going to be talking about how we want to move forward and what our next steps are and things like that. So with that, are there questions? And do any of you have questions or things you want to talk about?
No, I'm going to have to leave pretty soon. Dustin, are you thinking about scholarship as conversation? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll work on that too. So.
Okay.
And I went and accessed some of the learning activities earlier. And yeah, the one for scholarship conversation started me on some good ideas.
Oh, okay.
I need to look through the assessment. I'm not sure how to assess that because it's such a squishy, hard to measure concept.
Okay.
But, hopefully there's some ideas there that I can dig through.
Yeah, and what piqued my interest, this is the time of year when everyone's doing their poster presentations and their showcases. So I was thinking about looking at those.
Yeah, and the question's always, how many citations do I need for this?
Right.
I don't know, until you're done.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'm assuming, Sylvia, you're going to kind of continue, and I'll catch that recording later. But I'll have to redo my schedule so that I can stay longer for these.
Okay, sounds good.
All right.
I'll try to get this video. Please let me know if you can't access the videos, and I'll try to get this one up in a more timely fashion for you.
Oh, no problem. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Right, thank you. Bye, Kristen. So, Dustin, do you have any other questions or comments, discussions that you want to tackle today?
Nothing in particular. I mean, being completely honest, this late in the semester, there's no way I'm going to actually implement any of the stuff that we're doing.
Really?
Not this semester. They have a deadline of turning in a paper on Thursday. And I mean, at this point, with the scholarship, this conversation, if they're still gathering their sources, they're doomed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, at this point, I'm in the mindset of I'm trying to get ideas to how I'm going to structure this class when I teach it again back in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I hear you there. So I'm smiling. I don't think I have too many students in that boat, but there's a few that I'm nervous about. So
yeah, I'm preparing for a interesting conversation this afternoon.
So sure. So is there are there things that you need that we have not addressed for you?
Not really. I'm really. I mean, I'll have to dig through the resources that just got posted in the module to see, yeah, what tools are available.
Those 6 books, they come as a set. They're a bit pricey, but they actually have some really good ideas in them. And it depends. Like a bit pricey for an individual, but we got our library to buy them. So,
yeah.
And I think a bit. I don't know that they were all that expensive. They're paperback, but it was something that will be cool, but I didn't want to purchase for myself.
Right.
But they are a pretty good resource.
Okay.
They have more of a practical. They're pretty practical, which is what I like about them.
Yeah.
So. Okay. Anything else?
No, not that I can think of.
All right. Sounds good. So, well, I'll see you in a couple weeks. So I'll be looking forward to seeing what you come up with. It'll be exciting to see.
I'll be excited to see it too.
All righty.
All right. Thanks, Sylvia.
A lot. Have a good day. Bye.